Hello everyone, welcome to the first video of the Six Wicks channel. Tonight we are going to be talking about the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Specifically, we will be covering its history. Now, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn is a London-based occult society that was started in 1888 and ran for 12 years with about 100 members at its peak. Now, let's get one thing clear here. The Golden Dawn that we are talking about is not the neo-Nazi political faction in Greece, also called the Golden Dawn. Our Golden Dawn and this Golden Dawn are two very separate entities. These guys have nothing to do with what we are talking about tonight. Anyway, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn might not be as popular as, say, the Freemasons in the public conscious, but they are derived from it. I have circled the appropriate order from which it comes. If you cannot read that, that is okay. We will be discussing it soon enough. It is important to mention that the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn is responsible for laying down much of the groundwork of modern ceremonial magic and practice, as well as reviving the Western magic tradition. Behind me here are images of Golden Dawn rituals being practiced back when the Golden Dawn was functioning, and today. The majority of my research came from 4 books, which I have listed here in order. These books are Modern Ritual Magic by Francis King, as well as the introduction that he wrote for Mathers's Astral Projection, Ritual Magic, and Alchemy. The 3rd book I used was What You Should Know About the Golden Dawn, written by Israel Regadie, and the 4th book is A History of the Occult Tarot by Ronald and Michael Dummett. Now, there are 2 specific authors I would like to discuss. The first, Francis King, born Francis X. King, was an English author from London. Many of his works focus on occult subjects, and he was actually a member of the Society of the Inner Light, which was a splinter of the original Golden Dawn. Meanwhile, Israel Regadie is a British-American author who worked as Aleister Crowley's accountant for a short amount of time and briefly associated with Stella Matutina, another splinter of the Golden Dawn. He is responsible for publishing much of what we know about the Golden Dawn's system of magic, even though it incurred the wrath of the orders at the time. If not for his publications, who knows what we would have lost. Now, many of these books were published, well, maybe 20, 30 years ago, and so they might not capture some of the modern history that has passed. Thus, I also had to use some contemporary resources on the web, and we will address those as they come. So we shall begin our story in Kassel, Germany, in the 17th century. Specifically, in 1614, we would see the publication of a text titled The General Reformation of the Whole Wide World. This text was a German translation of a chapter from Traiano Bocciolini's News from Parnassus, and this text would focus on the state of the world at the time, as well as critiquing the various proposals that philosophers and religious groups had put out towards fixing it. Now, appended to the end of this text was the Fama Fraternitatis, likely added as a solution to the rejected proposals. Francis King suggests that it was included by the printer, not the actual writer of this text. The next year, in 1615, we would see the publication of a short consideration of the more secret philosophy. This was simply a summarization of John Dee's Monus Hieroglyphica, which had been published in 1564. Attached to the end of this was the Confessio Fraternitatis RC. Now, you might notice we have 3 texts up here. That is the chemical marriage of Christian Rosencrantz, but we will get to that one. I want to talk about these 2 first because they tell a intertwined or interrelated story. Beginning with the Confessio. This text tells the tale of a certain Christian Rosenkreuz, typically changed to Rosicross. This man was allegedly born in 1378, and he was born in Germany to a nobleman. He would go on to found the Fraternity of the Rosy Cross after his journeys in the East. Let's talk about that a little bit. Christian Rosenkreuz was educated in a monastery, and he would later go on to travel to Damkar, Arabia, seeking secrets from the wise men of the area. Some of the topics he would end up picking up were mathematics, physics, and the Arabic language. Using his studies in the Arabic language, he would end up translating the Book of Im during his 3-year stay in Damkar. He would later travel to Fez, Morocco, to further his knowledge. After some time, he would decide to return to Europe to share the knowledge he had acquired. He would land in Spain, but be promptly rejected by the University of Salamanca. The learned men of the university claimed that the devil's lectures that were given there were much more informational than anything Rosenkreutz could possibly say to them, and thus he would end up returning to Germany. So here in Germany, he would end up founding his fraternity with just 4 members and begin curing the sick in the area. As the number of patients rose, he would end up increasing the size of his order from 4 members to 8. The members would then take on a set of rules, such as bearing RC as their seal, curing the sick for free of charge, wearing plain clothes, meaning no distinguishing costumes, meeting at the house of the Holy Spirit on Corpus Christi, choosing successors, and, most enigmatically, keeping the fraternity secret for 100 years. These men, sworn to chastity and charity, would then disband after agreeing upon these rules, going their separate ways. The end of the text also describes how this fraternity was split into degrees. Also of note, the text ends on a strangely anti-Catholic note, which is very much unlike the next text, the Fama's, very Protestant message. The Fama would end up detailing the discovery of Christian Rosenkreutz's tomb. According to the tale, it was found behind a secret door in the house of the Holy Spirit, here on the left. It was revealed by removing a brass nail, and according to an inscription on the door, it had been kept secret for 120 years. The text dates the discovery to 1604. Behind the door was Rosenkreutz's heptagonal tomb, illuminated by a celestial light that was similar to, but decidedly not, the sun. The rays of light would illuminate a round altar that ended up containing the untouched and unconsumed body of Christian Rosenkreutz, his dead hands clutching a book of tea, which, King writes, is a book that the Rosicrucians valued just as much as the Bible, if a little less. Behind the walls of this tomb were various magical artifacts, such as scrying mirrors, crystal balls, and lamps that did not consume any fuel yet still burned. The text would also date Christian Rosenkreutz's death as being in 1484, which would have made him 106 years old if this was a true tale. And now we shall talk about that third text, which had a very different writing style than the other 2. This one, The Chemical Marriage of Christian Rosenkreutz, was published in 1616. It chronicles the journey that Christian Rosenkreutz would end up taking to a royal wedding that he had been anticipating for 7 years. It was dated to take place on Easter Eve. On his journey to the king's abode, he would find 4 paths before him. Only one would take him to the king's palace. On his way to the king's palace, he would end up finding 4 paths. Only one would take him where he intended to go, and each path must be fully traversed, he is told, for turning back would be death. He would deliberate, unsure of where to go. However, after he would end up helping a dove, he would come across 3 golden gates, each one adorned with, quote, strange and mystical devices. He would end up telling each gatekeeper that he was a brother of the Red Rosy Cross, and then make a trade. At the first one, he would give some water for a gold token, and at the second, he would end up giving salt for another gold token. If I remember correctly, either the second or the third gate is guarded by a lion. Eventually, Christian Rosenkreutz would end up making it to the wedding. He would be treated, alongside the other guests, to a grand feast before the king and queen would tell him that everyone would be facing the great balance. Everyone would end up being weighed, and Rosenkreutz, along with a few other guests, they would end up passing. They passed the test. The ones who failed, however, would be given an amnestic and turned away. Those who passed were then given the golden fleece and shown various things around the palace. Among these was a phoenix, which is known to be a symbol of Christ at the time. After all the things that they were shown, the king and queen would be slain and put in coffins. After the display, the guests were then taken to a 7-story Tower of the Gods, where they would begin preparing materials for the magnum opus, a very common topic in alchemy. After some time, they would end up completing the great work, which they would use to revive the king and queen. Rosenkreutz and the other guests would then be rewarded with the title of the Knights of the Golden and Rosy Cross. Now, many scholars agree that these texts are meant to be allegorical. They cover themes such as spiritual rebirth and alchemy. However, some occultists would end up taking these at face value. After these texts had circulated around Germany, many would end up begging via open letters and pamphlets for admission into this Rosicrucian order. However, many of them would receive no response. In fact, nobody received a response. Alongside the many people begging to join, a flurry of criticism and apologetics would take the printing press by storm regarding these texts. However, with the lack of any new publications, they would end up losing momentum. And then finally, when the 30 Years' War came around, it all but stamped out public interest in these texts as more grave concerns would end up taking their attention. Now, not everyone stopped paying attention to these texts, however. Francis King writes that Rosicrucianism had begun to intertwine with Freemasonry as early as 1638. Some Scottish Masonic lodges had already begun implementing Rosicrucian degrees in the 17th century, and independent Masonic orders would begin to adopt Rosicrucian practices by the late 18th century. Meanwhile, magic would also begin to experience a resurgence in the 17 and 1800s, after a dry spell in talismanic magic, necromancy, and astrology. Much of this would come with the influence of the late 18th century Romantic movement, reintroducing many Gothic elements that had lain dormant for some time. Of particular interest in the Romantic movement are the works of Ebenezer Sibley as well as Francis Barrett, pictured here on the left. Barrett would publish The Magus in 1801. Its goal was to create a system of occult philosophy within some odd 450 pages. Francis King writes that it tried to separate the wheat of the genuine theurgic tradition from the chaff that had become so thoroughly mixed with it. Behind me here is a little snippet from the text. The Magus would significantly impact the Western magical tradition and end up fueling its revival, especially when Barrett would establish a school of ritual magic in Marylebone. This would later see a derivative in Cambridge. Now, I believe it is appropriate to move on to our next topic of discussion, the Masonic influences of the Golden Dawn. Specifically, we will be talking about Societas Rosicruciana and Anglia, SRIA. It would be founded between 1865 and 67 by Robert Wentworth Little. It was similar to the Scottish Rosicrucian Society, but was different in that it only admitted Freemasons, not just anyone off the street. Many of its rituals are allegedly based on old manuscripts that were owned and read by Little himself. Additionally, it would be split into 9 grades of 3 orders. In our first order, we have Zelator, Theoricus, Practicus, and Philosophus. In the second order, we have Adeptus Minor, Adeptus Major, and Adeptus Exemptus. Then the third order would have just 2 grades, Magister Templi and Magus. Now, according to Decker and Dummett, the SRIA's structure is based on a German Rosicrucian society called the Order of the Golden and Rosy Cross. It would be founded in Berlin in 1757 and peter out in around 1790. This German society admitted Masons holding at least the first 3 grades and emphasized alchemy, Kabbalah, and used complex rituals in many of its initiations. Additionally, it used the concept of secret superiors. There would be no more than 9 members in each grade, and each one would have a secret name that changed triennially. In effect, nobody knew the true identity of their superiors. Now, back to the SRIA, they did not engage in politics, alchemy, or any practical magic like its German precursor. In fact, dinners and lectures are a much more common activity for this group. William Carpenter, the writer of the SRIA's journal The Rosicrucian, describes it as being a purely literary and antiquarian organization. Regadie would also write that the SRIA's purpose was to, quote, afford mutual aid and encouragement in working out the great problems of life and in discovering the secrets of nature, to facilitate the study of the systems of philosophy founded on the Kabbalah and the doctrines of Hermes Trismegistus. Hermes Trismegistus being a character that is mentioned in the Kybalion, a seminal work of the Hermetic philosophy. Now, despite the lack of magical practice within this order, there were still some members who were interested in it. And thus, Frederick Holland would start the Society of Eight in 1883 within the SRIA. It would primarily study alchemy, ceremonial magic, and practical magic. Let's talk about some of its members, because a lot of these members would end up playing a hand in the Golden Dawn's formation. One of these members was Frederick Hockley. He was known in many circles for his vast library of occult literature and his studies of esoteric philosophy, magic, and psychic mediumship. He was described by King as a great collector of ancient magical texts. Additionally, he was a student at Barrett's School of Magic in Marylebone. It should also be noted that he was the one who noted the interactions between Eliphas Levi and his student R.H. Mackenzie, shown here on the left. As for an image of Hockley himself, I could not find any useful images, so I had to settle for neglecting him from this list. Of course, another member of this group was the aforementioned Mackenzie, and a certain William Wynne Westcott, shown here in the middle. Westcott is a founding member of the Golden Dawn, and he was an occult scholar, knowledgeable in Kabbalah and John Dee's Enochian magic system. After Hockley passed away, Samuel Liddell Mathers would end up taking his place. Here is a painting of him done by his wife, I believe. Anyway, Mathers was also very well known in these circles for his knowledge. Specifically, he was the one responsible for translating the Keys of Solomon. And of course, Mathers is also another founder of the Golden Dawn. But it should be noted that his membership in the Society of Eight was very short-lived, as it would end up folding in November, a mere 10 days after Hockley passed. And now we can finally get into the meat of how the Golden Dawn was created. Enough setup. We will finally see how it was started. So, the Golden Dawn, it should be known, was founded on a set of 60 unnumbered sheets written in cipher, some marked 1809, that had come into the possession of Wilfred Wynne Westcott. Now, the origins of these documents and how Westcott came to possess them is ultimately undecided. There are several theories, which we will cover, but the consensus is that he gained these manuscripts in 1886. Regadie writes that Westcott had ended up gaining these manuscripts after succeeding the late Robert Wentworth Little as the chief of the SRIA, having found them in his library of occult texts. However, Regadie also mentions an alternative theory of him finding these manuscripts on a bookstall in Farringdon Street, which is admittedly a little more pedestrian, doesn't have much flair to it. Francis King, meanwhile, writes that Westcott was possibly given these documents by Reverend Adolphus Frederick Alexander Woodford, here on the left, before his passing. Before they were in Woodford's hands, they were in the hands of Hockley, but he had died not long ago. Should be noted, however, that Decker and Dummett bring up the claim that Westcott lied about even receiving these from Woodman in the first place. And there are some pretty good points of evidence to suggest this. Firstly, it should be noted that Woodford was not even a member of the SRIA. Additionally, the manuscripts reference the Egyptian ritual of the dead, which would not be published until 1842. Now, they do provide a reasonable rebuttal. Westcott may have genuinely believed in the manuscript's antiquity. Behind me here are the contents of these manuscripts. Not every sheet, I didn't have space for 60 of them, but here are just a few of them. We can see that they are written from right to left, and they are indeed in cipher. Westcott would end up recognizing this cipher as the alchemical cipher given by Trithemius and Polygraphia. Up here on the left, the top left specifically, is what that cipher looks like in its original text. So what did these manuscripts even contain? Well, they contained sketches of 5 grade rituals for admitting candidates. This also included summaries of knowledge required for grade examinations. The grades given were Neophyte, Zelator, Theoricus, Practicus, and Philosophus. Sound familiar? The last 4 would be given relations to specific sephira on the Kabbalistic tree of life. Indeed, this order would bear a great resemblance to the Order of the Golden and Rosy Cross. I think it is important to mention some of the things that were in these manuscripts. First, there was many added symbols within the mix, specifically Enochian words of power, the Chaldean oracles, which is a Neoplatonic work, and references to the enigmatic Kibiri. The Rosicrucian stripped bare, a text detailing the workings of the Order of the Golden and Rosy Cross, while also offering a little bit of criticism, well, actually a large heap of criticism, is also a suggested source for the features of this system. Included within these manuscripts are also references to Eliphas Levi's work, not only explaining the prevalence of Kabbalah, but also explaining the Daniel's Man and Altar of Incenses diagrams, as these pictures also appear in his Key of the Greater Mysteries. Additionally, there are some references to relatively obscure occult texts within, such as those from the mystic Jane Lead and the Philadelphians. Finally, we'll touch on the fact that there appears to be a great reliance on Magister Pianco's tables that appear in Mackenzie's Royal Masonic Cyclopedia. This might give us a hint into who exactly wrote these manuscripts. Most surprising of all, however, believe it or not, is the fact that these manuscripts end with the phrase "End of First Order," raising questions regarding the completeness of these manuscripts. To summarize, the manuscripts contained blueprints for an entire system of magic, as well as an order built around it. Westcott dubs the magical order within these manuscripts the Order of the Golden Dawn, borrowing the name from a Frankfurt lodge founded in 1808 named the Lodge of the Rising Dawn. Decker and Dummett posed the theory that Mackenzie had made these manuscripts, intending to use them for either the Society of Eight or even an entirely new order. So, in 1887, when Westcott finished deciphering the manuscripts, he would show his work to Mathers. Mathers would react favorably to these manuscripts, and after Westcott offered to pay him for services, Mathers agreed to help Westcott in converting the basic system of magic into a fully functioning lodge. Mathers would then onboard Dr. William Robert Woodman to assist in the matter. Now, behind me here, allegedly the manuscripts mentioned a Fräulein Anna Sprengel of Nuremberg, who was apparently a high-grade Rosicrucian. Westcott would end up reaching out and receive a reply in November of 1887. Sprengel would then, over letter, raise Westcott into the Second Order and give him a charter to start a Golden Dawn temple in England, as well as elect 2 chiefs. Sprengel would write again in January of 1888, giving Westcott permission to sign her motto on any necessary documents. He would end up using these to nominate Mathers and Woodman as chiefs. Together, Mathers, Westcott, and Woodman were given the Adeptus Exemptus grade, and they would found the Isis Urania Temple in London of that year. I believe the interior of it is this here on the left. Francis King writes that its foundation came at a time when many people were beginning to feel dissatisfied with the pathetically overconfident materialism of the 19th century science on one hand, and the fatuous pietism of fundamentalist religion on the other. Those who had been attracted by the spiritual and intellectual content of Blavatsky's theosophy, but repelled by its oriental form, would begin to find their way into the Golden Dawn. Now, before we continue, let's address the elephant in the room. The existence of Anna Sprengel is dubious at best. It is typical for Masonic lodges to require the nod of a chief, or at least some form of lineage, before another temple can be formed. Thus, Anna Sprengel was likely invented by Westcott to allow the Golden Dawn a form of connection or ancient pedigree, common to other esoteric secret-bearing societies as a form of establishing authority. And we have a little bit of evidence towards this. Sprengel's motto, Sapiens Dominabitur Astris, appears on the title page of Valentin Wiegel's Astrology Theologized, published in 1649, which this is the gentleman who had published that text. Westcott perhaps based Sprengel off of Wiegel. Decker and Dummett also mention the suspicions of German language expert Christopher Wells. Wells says that the German in Sprengel's correspondence was fluent but not flawless, It had the features of an Englishman who was acquainted with the German language, but of course was not a natural speaker. So, shortly after the Isis Urania Temple was founded, a couple more would end up popping up. The Osiris Temple would be made in Weston-super-Mare, Horus Temple would be made in Bradford, and the Amen-Ra Temple would be made in Edinburgh. Regadie writes that the membership of the Golden Dawn was recruited from every circle. It included physicians, psychologists, clergymen, artists, philosophers, and normal men and women, humble and unknown, from every walk of life. It was interesting in the fact that it accepted men and women regardless of Mason's status. In fact, Mathers would end up meeting Moina, his future wife, through the Golden Dawn. Here is a photo of the two lovebirds. However, it should be mentioned that Osiris ceased to function after its chief died in 1895, and the Horus Temple would close its doors in 1902 for reasons I could not quite find. And so the Golden Dawn would continue on. It would reach its height in the 1890s. However, a surprising event would happen in 1891. Westcott would receive correspondence claiming that Anna Sprengel had passed away, signaling the end of communications between the Golden Dawn and the Rosicrucian Order. The letter was allegedly from the companions of Sprengel, who did not approve of her actions in creating a new temple, but they did not interfere out of respect for her. But it was made clear that there would be no more information coming to the members of the Golden Dawn, unless they were willing to create a link to the secret chiefs of the Order to gain additional information. Now, given what we mentioned earlier about Sprengel possibly not being a real person, Decker and Dummett believe that the death of this character was almost staged as a means of tying up a loose end. Now that the Order was founded and the chiefs were instated, there was no more need for Sprengel. So, she died. In this same year, Woodman would end up passing away, leaving just Mathers and Westcott to rule together for 6 years. Now, much of the Golden Dawn's magical work was magical theory. It left little room for practice. All in all, it was relatively basic, no better than the SRIA without its Society of Eight. Thus, Mathers would end up establishing the Second Order in 1982, naming it Ordo Rosier Rubae et Audae Crucis. It was created after Mathers claimed to have secured a link to the secret chiefs. Now, it should be mentioned, the secret chiefs that he mentions are very similar to the masters mentioned by Madame Blavatsky of the Theosophical Society. Mathers would end up creating a ritual for the new Adeptus Minor grade, basing it on the story of the discovery of Rosenkreuz's tomb. Now, just an interesting piece of information, this tomb, remember, it had 7 walls. Not many buildings come with 7 walled rooms. Thus, the Vault of the Adepts, it was called, was more of a movable structure, bearing 7 walls and a ceiling and floor. A portable tomb, if you would. Anyway, the intent of the Second Order was to be akin to a school for occult knowledge and practical magic. Reportedly, this was not in Westcott's tastes. And so it was thus that 25 members would be initiated into the Second Order. The first one to be initiated was Miss Annie Horniman, shown here on the right. She was a generous individual, according to Regadie, who would financially support Mathers and Moina for some time. Additionally, Moina would also have her artistic endeavors supported by Horniman. After Annie Horniman, Florence Farr would also be initiated into the Second Order, Florence Farr being a popular actress at the time. Like the Order of the Golden and Rosy Cross, our German Rosicrucian Order we keep mentioning, the Outer Order members, or First Order if you will, were not informed of who was even in the Second Order. Neither were they informed who its chiefs were, what they did, or even when and where they would meet. Now, despite things going fairly well for the Golden Dawn so far, things would not remain so. Cracks would begin to form as personalities clashed within the Order. Israel Regadie writes that Mathers may not have been a benevolent chief. For many were the misunderstanding, he writes, that ruffled the mystic placidity of his temples, and several of the individuals who dared so much as to differ or argue with him were promptly expelled and flung into the outer darkness. And so let's talk about one of the first moments that these cracks began to show, which would start with Edward Berridge here. Berridge was intensely loyal to Mathers, and he was a sub-imperator of the Isis Urania Temple in London. He would end up distributing a pamphlet titled Respiro to members. This pamphlet would espouse the doctrines of the New Life religious group and the philosophies of Thomas Lake Harris, which would include the rather infamous topic of sex magic. Horniman would read this and become extremely offended, writing to Mathers about it. However, Mathers would end up brushing her off. In response to this, Helen Rand would write back. In particular, Helen Rand requested that Berridge be demoted for his actions. Now, because Horniman had a hand in the financial situation of Mr. and Mrs. Mathers, and because she was the reason that Mr. Mathers had a job with the museum, he didn't have many options, and thus he reluctantly forced him to resign his position. Now, there would be some points of contention between Horniman wanting to foster the artistic talents of Moina. However, there would be a slight wrench thrown in the plans when Mr. and Mrs. Mathers would go on to start the Ahathur Temple in Paris. Horniman would then take concern with Mathers regarding his increased amount of drinking. She had quite a strict personal code that she adhered to. She would also be annoyed by Mathers' political activities, specifically referring to the Celtic Revival movement, which the Celtic Revival would be the reason why not only Mathers' motto was rendered in Gaelic rather than Latin, but he would end up adding MacGregor into his full name, making it Samuel Lydell MacGregor Mathers. She would also be annoyed by his extravagance and his continued demands for funds. In fact, Mr. and Mrs. Mathers would end up making scathing replies to her concerned letters sent between 95 and 96. The relationship between Mathers and Horniman would rapidly deteriorate before it all came to a head. Mathers would make 13 accusations toward Horniman's conduct in July of 96. In September of that year, Horniman would announce her intent to resign, and Mathers would seal the deal, fully expelling her in December after she refused to send more money to the couple. Westcott would hear of these affairs, and while he was horrified, he refused to stand up to Mathers, offering only sympathy towards the affected. F.L. Gardner would end up drawing a petition to reinstate Horniman, but it bore no fruit. Another event would happen towards the end of 1896, where Mathers feared his power was waning as one of the chiefs. He would end up putting out a manifesto to all members, affirming that he was the sole link to the secret chiefs. He would also require members reading it to sign a written statement of voluntary submission to him. And the consequences for refusing were dire. Refusing submission at all would equal expulsion. And then, as much as doubting the link between him and the secret chiefs would result in a demotion to a lower grade. Then in March of 1897, another big surprise would rock the order. Westcott would resign from all Golden Dawn offices. Now, he would be succeeded by Florence Farr. Regadie gives a theory that Westcott had left order manuscripts in a portfolio with his signature on it inside of a cab. The driver would of course give these documents to the authorities, and because Westcott was the Queen's coroner, his employers were disgusted. They thought he should have no connection to the occult, and thus he was given an ultimatum: resign from his post as the Queen's coroner, or resign from all Golden Dawn offices. You can obviously see the choice that he made. He chose his livelihood over his passion. An alternate theory is that Mathers was simply a difficult character to work with, and so Westcott withdrew so he could focus his energies on the SRIA instead of the Golden Dawn. Whatever the case may be, this left Mathers as the sole authority. During all this, there would be increasing amounts of unrest among members, not only over the 2 vacant chief spots, but also over the unfulfilled promises of more advanced material. The Golden Dawn members were hungry for more magic, but Mathers was either unable to or unwilling to give them more material, and thus they would end up declaring Mathers inept. And this would only add to the increasing tensions within the order, finally coming to the head with the inclusion of one member. In 1898, we would see the infamous Aleister Crowley become involved in the Golden Dawn, which This whole escapade would end up being the final straw for many of its members. After reading a book written by author Edward Waite, Mathers would begin correspondence with him, and he would end up taking a great amount of interest in occult literature, especially on the topic of Kabbalah. Later, in Switzerland, he would end up meeting two members, John Cecil Jones and Julian Baker. In 1898, he would end up being initiated as a neophyte at Mark Mason's Hall in London. Regadie says that Crowley was very gifted. He advanced rapidly through his coursework and very readily absorbed the practices brought before him. However, he was also seen by members as undisciplined and unrestrained, which I suppose there is a grain of truth to this statement. The rapid progress that Crowley was making within the order grades would end up being halted by the Isis Urania Temple. Specifically, he would be refused initiation into the grade of Adeptus Minor, and would also be denied his portal papers, the portal being a sort of interstitial grade between the first and second orders. He would be denied on the grounds of moral turpitude, pernicious conduct, and rumors regarding his practicing of sex magic. Now, this greatly upset Mathers, and then he would personally initiate Crowley at the Ahathor Temple in Paris on January 16, 1900. Whether he did this out of genuine interest for Crowley or simply to defy the Second Order is anyone's guess. Whatever the case may be, Crowley would then return to the Isis Urania Temple, request the papers entitled to him, and then return to Boleskine to make preparations for the Abramelin operation, which was a highly complicated ritual that would allegedly summon one's guardian angel. After Crowley was initiated at Ahathor, Farr, the chief of Isis Urania now, would end up sending her letter of resignation, although she did agree to wait for a successor in the meantime. Surprisingly, Mathers flat out refused, claiming that Westcott was trying to create a schism. He would make two additional claims as well. He would first say that Westcott forged the materials received from Sprengel, and then go on to add that he had never made contact with Sprengel in the first place. Farr would ask Westcott about these allegations, and he would neither confirm nor deny in his response. Thus, a 7-man committee would be formed within the Second Order to investigate this matter to its fullest. Mathers refused to provide any evidence, despite saying he could, quote, prove to the hilt every word. Then, after much heated correspondence, he would additionally refuse to acknowledge the authority and even the existence of the committee at all. Now, these allegations were very serious for members of the Golden Dawn. Specifically, a great deal of concern rose within the ranks due to the fact that it was upon the authority of this alleged correspondence that the order was even founded. Quote, the historical position of the order, as descended from the medieval Rosicrucian sources, collapsed should it be proven that the correspondence had been forged. After this, and after Mathers being swindled by Madame Horus, which we will mention soon, all but 5 members of the Second Order would end up voting to strip Mathers of his title and expel him from the Golden Dawn. After this, Mathers would end up responding with threats of psychic attacks. Amid this schism, Crowley would end up siding with Mathers, acting as his representative. After going to Paris, speaking with Mathers, and returning to London with his instructions, he had a couple of goals in mind. Well, his main goal was to regain control of the Vault of Adepts, for it was locked out. To help him with this, he was given a warrant to the Isis Urania Temple. He was also given McCarthyist instructions to individually interview each member with the help of some magical instructions. These interviews would help Mathers decide who would be kicked out and who would be kept in the new order. He was also given specific instructions on what to do if Madame Horus was spotted on the scene. None of the adepts, however, would interview Crowley. So, in response, he did what any reasonable man would do. He hired muscles to remove these men from the premise. Now, this recovery of the Vault of Adepts would be very short-lived, as they would return with Metropolitan Police, and they would intervene on the behalf of the Second Order. Afterwards, the Second Order would then convince Crowley's creditors to issue a writ against him. After all of this, Crowley would throw his hands up and just give up. Shortly after this, he would also go on to cut ties with Mathers over a quarrel. King states that this was over Mahayana Buddhism, if I remember correctly. But it could just simply be a case of these two very strong personalities not being able to coexist anymore. Mathers would go on to create his own order, while Crowley would claim that Mathers was possessed, and also include him and other Golden Dawn members within his novel, I believe it was called Moonchild, as very cartoonishly evil villains. And so Regadie summarizes it as thus. Mathers expelled the rebels, who then formed a schism. On the other hand, it is also held that he was himself expelled by the revolting wing from his own order and left with about a half-dozen adherents, with whose assistance, moral and financial, he continued his temple. Even though Mathers was out of the picture, they were not out of the woods yet. And so that concludes part 1 of our history on the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. If you happen to recognize any errors or misinformation I might have accidentally included in my video, please, by all means, let me know in the comments and I will issue corrections in the next part. Part 2 will cover the aftermath of our schism and follow the paths of all the separate splinters that our society, once whole, would make after it was shattered. Thank you for watching, and have a good night.